It happens at 10:30 a.m., three firm knocks that carry the same flat certainty as the line I can't unhear. The one that said a funeral is only a ceremony. The sound reaches through the hallway and pulls me back to the empty pew I stared at while the organ hummed and the minister's voice softened itself around Thomas's name. I remember how starch clung to the navy sleeve I had pressed that morning, the fabric warm beneath my palm, even as the man who wore it had already gone cold. Grief has a smell if you let it close enough linen spray, old wood, church wax, rain on coats, small, honest things that make you ache because they stayed when a person did not. When I open the door, I notice details before I allow meaning to follow. Brooke's hand is locked around her purse like a hinge that won't give. Caleb's eyes move the way a contractor walks a room, quick and practical, catching corners, measuring distance. I tell myself to breathe. I tell myself to stand still in my own house so the rooms remember who set the table and who folded the blankets and who learned the exact place the floor creaks near the vent by the stairs. They did not come for memories. They came for words people use when they are afraid to say the ones that hurt. Assets, paperwork, next steps. I feel the divide rise like a thin pane of glass on this side. Legacy, on that side, ledgers. I do not speak it aloud. I let the thought pass through me the way rain passes through a screen door, leaving a pattern. Yes, but not changing the shape of the door. I choose the clock instead of the moment. Not now. Not in a threshold where shoes drip and tempers pretend to be calm. The kitchen is where hard truths live in this house, so the kitchen will keep them. I tell my body to soften its shoulders. I hold the quiet the way you hold a plate that's too hot with care and a plan. There will be a proper time. I will set it. I will pour coffee into heavy mugs and keep my voice low enough to honor the man who taught me the difference between patience and postponement. All morning, I have kept one envelope at the edge of the table, a certified thing with an inked stamp and my name written like someone remembered who I am. I have not yet unfolded what waits inside because I know it is not only numbers, it is a promise Thomas asked me to keep when keeping anything felt impossible. When I walk them back to the porch and choose a later hour, I touch the envelope with 2 fingers, and the paper answers with its own small weight. What it holds is heavier than money and clearer than anger. I will open it next, and the kitchen will hear what it asks of me. When the house grew silent after Thomas's funeral, I thought the worst was behind me, but the silence had weight, the kind that presses on your chest when you're alone in the dark. That's when the mailman knocked, holding a certified envelope that felt heavier than paper ought to. Mr. Lewis's neat handwriting stretched across the front like a second heartbeat. My hands trembled as I traced it, the ink deep enough to feel. I sat at Thomas's desk, the one he polished every Sunday night, and opened the seal with a kitchen knife. Inside was his voice, not in sound, but in intention. I could almost hear him clearing his throat, the way he did before saying something he knew would make me uneasy. What I found left me breathless. Thomas had quietly built a fortune over the years' investments, real estate, accounts I never knew existed. $22 million, hidden like a fortress around our family. Not for vanity, not for indulgence, but for safety. That was Thomas through and through. He never wanted monuments, only shelter. But shelter with strings? His plan was never about money, it was about Caleb. Every cent depended on our son proving his character. Not just claiming his inheritance. If Caleb failed, if he lived small and selfish, then the entire sum would flow into the Carter family foundation. a cause Thomas believed in with the marrow of his bones. The weight of it crushed me. I wanted to slam the envelope shut, to pretend I hadn't seen. I am a mother, not a judge. And yet Thomas had trusted me to guard this test, to watch our son step into manhood or falter. Buried among the documents was a smaller account, about 300,000. A mirror, Thomas called it, meant to reflect who Caleb really was. I understood. This was never meant to punish, only to reveal. Still, my heart ached at the thought of using it against him. I sat for a long time with that envelope pressed to my chest, whispering that I wasn't strong enough. But Thomas's voice lingered, "Be brave for me." So I decided I would begin small, with the mirror account. At a Sunday dinner, I scheduled for 6 p.m. sharp. I folded the letter back into its envelope, smoothed the crease, and placed it where Thomas's Bible used to rest. The promise had been made, whether I liked it or not. By 6 p.m. sharp, the house carried the old rhythm Thomas had left behind. The pot roast sent its weight into the air. Bread cooled on the counter, and the clock in the hallway gave its deliberate tick, as if to remind me this was not an ordinary supper. Caleb sat across from me, shoulders stiff, fork moving more by habit than appetite. I studied the strain in his jaw, the way hunger lived beside pride, each tugging at him in silence. I had prepared more than a meal. On the table beside my plate lay a folder, plain and steady. When I slid it open, the paper inside showed a figure just shy of 300,000. My voice stayed even as I explained what it meant, a mirror Thomas had left behind. Not a prize, but a reflection. I reminded him that money without character is only paper, and that Thomas had tied every cent to the simplest of measures, respect for family rituals, responsibility in daily life, and service that lifts more than oneself. As I spoke, I saw Caleb's eyes shift, catching the numbers before the meaning. His breathing grew shallower, and in the set of his mouth, I recognized the old impatience, the habit of thinking first of what might be done for him instead of what he might yet do. My heart ached with compassion, for I remembered the boy who once brought me dandelions from the yard, convinced they were treasure. But I kept caution close too, knowing that sentiment alone could not protect Thomas's legacy. The stumble came softly. Instead of resting in the promise, he leaned toward the possibility of what relief might reach him, as though my duty were to lift his burdens before he had shown the strength to carry any. I felt frustration, quiet but sharp, like a pebble in the shoe you cannot ignore. Yet I did not scold, nor did I close the door. I simply folded the papers back into the folder, let the leather cover fall with gentleness, and told him with my eyes more than words take time to think. The sound of the doorbell cut through the stillness, and then Brooke appeared for dessert, perfume rising ahead of her, her laughter too quick for the room. She sat, bright and restless, and I could feel how the air shifted. The numbers on the page now weighed heavier than the names we had spoken. I walked them both out after coffee, my voice soft, my hand steady on the doorframe. Nothing had been lost yet, but neither had anything been earned. The boundaries would need to hold, and the town itself would soon carry whispers of what had passed inside. The phone began its shrill chorus at 07:07 a.m. sharp. I let it ring, one call after another, until the machine clicked and swallowed Caleb's voice. I stood at the sink, rinsing a coffee cup, letting the water run longer than needed. Silence, I realized, could be its own kind of shield. I wasn't required to pick up every time he remembered I existed. Later that morning, the knock came. When I opened the door, Brooke stood there with a plastic-wrapped bundle of carnations from the supermarket checkout line. Her smile looked as if it had been pressed flat, too practiced, too careful. I thanked her, but I didn't step aside. A mother learns to read what isn't said. The flowers weren't apology. They were strategy. She wanted a foothold, and I could not allow it. My words were gentle, my posture steady. I drew the line with kindness, but without room for debate. She left, the carnations drooping slightly as she walked back to her car. The day carried whispers too. By afternoon, Margaret from the post office called, her voice sharp with loyalty. She said Caleb had been asking about my certified mail. I wasn't surprised. In a town this size, you can't tug at a thread without the whole sweater noticing. Margaret's tone carried the weight of a warning he was prying where he didn't belong. Small towns remember who raised you, and they don't easily forgive when you forget your roots. By week's end, I sat in Mr. Lewis's office across the mahogany desk, sunlight falling through the lace curtains. I asked him to adjust Thomas's trust, not to close the door, but to turn it into a set of stepping stones, smaller disbursements, linked to responsibility and growth. Each stage earned instead of assumed. Mr. Lewis nodded with quiet approval. I felt Thomas in the room with us, approving too. On the drive home, I thought about Caleb's eyes at the dinner table, flickering between hope and calculation. I thought about Brooke's carnations wilting on my counter, their stems cloudy in tap water, and I knew the time had come to stop circling around what Thomas had written. That evening, I called Caleb and invited him for another Sunday dinner, this time alone. At 18:06 p.m., I would set the table, not only with food, but with truth. I would sit him in the kitchen, the heart of our house, and I would read Thomas's letter aloud. The words were meant for him, but they needed my voice to carry them. The promise would finally leave the envelope, and with it, no place left to hide. By 18:06 p.m., the kitchen glowed with the low light Thomas always preferred at supper. I had baked an apple pie, its sweetness rising in the air like a hymn. The table was simple 2 plates, heavy mugs, and the envelope resting at the center. I unfolded the letter and read it aloud, though the words came through me more as thought than sound. Thomas's handwriting carried his steadiness measured, careful, sure. He wrote of the fortune he had hidden, but more than that, he wrote of the man he hoped our son might still become. His lines spoke of discipline, of respect for tradition, of service to something greater than the self. They were not scolding words, only a father's deep plea that his son learn what wealth alone could never teach. When my voice fell silent, the kitchen held its breath. Caleb sat across from me, his face turned down, his hand flexing as though holding back something sharp. And in that silence, I understood what he hadn't said. He hadn't skipped the funeral because he didn't care. He had skipped it because grief threatened to drown him. He had feared that if he sat in that front pew and saw the casket, he would crumble in front of everyone, and he chose absence over breaking. That choice wounded me. Yes, but in that moment, I finally saw the fear behind it. After dinner, I walked him upstairs to his old room. In a drawer, beneath school medals and folded shirts that no longer fit, I found the navy compass Thomas once carried. The brass had dulled with time, but it turned in my hand as if it still knew where north was. I pressed it into Caleb's palm. A direction, not an answer. We set the reset together, though I made it clear no shortcuts, no sudden windfalls. He would move back home for a season. He would take a modest job, $15 an hour, stocking shelves at the hardware store. And he would start small, helping where help was needed, learning the rhythm of ordinary service. My tone was gentle, but it carried a boundary, one Thomas would have approved of. For the first time in years, I heard a note of apology in his posture, if not in words. Something softened in him, and something unclenched in me. Then the phone rang. I answered, and Brooke's voice spilled into the quiet, tight and urgent. What she said in that moment bent the path we were walking, and I felt my steady breath catch. The test had only just begun. The call that night carved a silence into the house. Brooke's voice was unsteady, and the words she pushed out left me gripping the counter for balance. She was 4 months pregnant. My first reaction was anger that this news arrived like a thunderclap after years of distance and denial. Anger that my son had not steadied his own footing before bringing a child into the world. But under the heat of that anger came something quieter, a flicker of unexpected respect. Because even before the dust settled, Caleb squared his shoulders and said he would stand by this child, no matter how little he had to give. He kept that promise in ways that astonished me. With his hardware store job, $15 an hour and not a penny more, he began setting aside envelopes, small bills folded neatly, marked for prenatal care. I watched him hand Brooke grocery money, not as a grand gesture, but as a steady rhythm. Week after week, he refused to even touch the accounts Thomas had left behind, saying he would not lean on what wasn't yet his to claim. It startled me, that refusal. It sounded like Thomas speaking through him, discipline in a voice I thought I'd lost. Then came the papers. A lawyer representing Brooke's family slid them across a table one afternoon, their words dressed up in legal formality, but cutting like a blade. They offered Caleb peace if he surrendered his parental rights, as if fatherhood were something you could sign away like an old lease. I saw his hands tremble, but I also saw the fire in his eyes when he tore those papers in half, the pieces scattering like feathers on the floor. That was the moment I knew he was choosing the harder right, even if it meant stepping into storms that would test him more than comfort ever could. The months that followed looked nothing like the life Caleb once lived. His shoes grew worn at the heels from extra shifts, his hands blistered from carrying lumber and lifting crates. He started showing up early, sweeping the hardware aisles before the manager even unlocked the doors. On Sundays, he mowed Mrs. Patterson's yard without pay, just to keep her from straining her bad back. He helped at the church pantry, stacking canned goods with a patience I hadn't seen in him since boyhood. None of it was glamorous, but all of it built a kind of muscle deeper than the body, a muscle of character. I kept watch, both proud and cautious, knowing the foundation of a man isn't built in a single season. Still, the evidence was there in the quiet ways. A lunchbox packed the night before, the click of boots leaving before sunrise, the return of a tired but settled son who no longer hid behind excuses. On the night before the court hearing, I set the table like a soldier laying out armor: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans with butter, and the last jar of peach preserves Thomas had canned before his illness. We ate not in celebration, but in preparation. Each bite was a reminder that we were not entering the courthouse alone. Family, faith, and the unseen strength of Thomas's hopes were going with us. When Caleb pushed back his chair, I saw the weight on his face, but also the steel beneath it. He was no longer avoiding grief or responsibility. He was walking into it, head high. The next morning, we stepped into the courthouse hallway. The walls smelled of polish and paper, and the air was tight with expectation. I steadied my breath. The verdict and the final test waited just beyond those doors. The courthouse smelled of polish and nerves. The benches creaked under shifting weight, and I sat with my hands clasped so tightly, my knuckles ached. When the judge finally spoke, the words came like air after a held breath-joint custody. Caleb would not be erased from his child's life. My shoulders dropped, and for the first time in months, I let myself exhale without fear. That evening, I asked Caleb to follow me into Thomas's study. The air in that room still carried the faint scent of his pipe tobacco, though the pipe itself had long been set aside. On the desk lay the portfolio I had kept hidden until now. Inside it, the truth, $22 million in carefully built investments in real estate. The life's work of a man who valued shelter over show. I told Caleb why I had waited. Money, I explained, is not a gift, it is a test. It does not create character. It only magnifies it. I reminded him of the nights he came home with blistered hands, the mornings he left before sunrise, the quiet service no one applauded. That was what proved him worthy, not the balance on a ledger. The portfolio was not for indulgence. Together we decided on modest steps, a small house not far from mine. Enough space for a nursery and a patch of yard. I remember standing with him one night at 10:30 p.m. paint rollers in our hands. The two of us brushing pale yellow across nursery walls. He laughed, paint flecks on his hair, and in that sound, I heard the boy he had been and the father he was becoming. The greater share of Thomas's fortune flowed outward into what we named the Thomas Carter Foundation. Its mission was simple: to keep families together when crisis threatened to tear them apart. Thomas would have smiled at that, his money becoming shelter for strangers, his name spoken quietly in gratitude by those who never knew him. Among the papers I gave Caleb was one last letter, Thomas's final words to his son. I read it aloud. Though the ink was his father's, the meaning was mine to carry. It said, in essence, I built this not so you could avoid the weight of life, but so you could carry it with dignity, love your family, serve your neighbors, and remember that true wealth is measured in who stands beside you when the storms come. Months later, I found myself leaning on the doorframe of Caleb's modest home. Inside, he sat with his child nestled in his lap, reading Goodnight Moon in a steady voice. Outside, I had just received word that the foundation's first grant had kept another family in their home, their lights still burning because Thomas's foresight had reached them. I realized then that the work money can't do is exactly what love, discipline, and courage must, and that was enough. If you've ever had to choose the hard right over the easy wrong, I'd love to hear your story. Share it, like this, so someone else might find hope in it.